Good morning. My name is Max Gruenig with E3G in Washington, D.C. I welcome you to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung E3G Forum on Climate, Trade and Development. I'll be moderating for you today, and I want to start the event with opening remarks from Paul Linnarz, the director of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, the office in the United States. Paul, thank you so much for opening our event today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Good morning to our participants in the United States. Good afternoon to our participants in Europe, especially to some participants, of course, who are here from the West Coast. It's quite early in the morning. Caroline, thank you so much. We are all crossing the time divide from West Coast to East Coast and crossing the Atlantic to Europe and beyond. You're all making this virtual transatlantic event possible. Thank you so much. Please let me introduce me again. Max already said a few words about me. I'm Paul Linnarz. I'm the director of the US office of the German Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or in English, Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, based in Washington, D.C. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung has partnered with E3G to bring experts from Europe, the United States, and developing countries to help frame a global agenda on meeting some of the challenges of the 21st century. We are here with two distinguished experts, Dr. Caroline Freund and Peter Young, who will discuss the findings in the recently launched study titled The Climate Trade Development Nexus, Pathways Towards Transatlantic Cooperation. It just so happens that exactly at this moment, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, is hosting a large virtual Major Economies Forum on energy and climate. We are hopeful that our study can perhaps provide some food for thought and inspire stakeholders to find innovative solutions. Our experts today will help us break down, let's say, the silo mentality when too often experts work in one policy area and unaware of how decisions in trade, for example, may have a direct or indirect impact on climate change or developing countries. It is no small undertaking, of course, to bring three distinct policy areas together and show their interconnectivity. We at the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, together with E3G, have worked through workshops, webinars, and this study to, let's say, cross-pollinate ideas. We intend to share knowledge and to combine intellectual capital with the hope that we reach innovative solutions to the many pressing challenges that confront trade, climate, and development. I would like to take this opportunity, of course, to sincerely thank Max Gruenig, Senior Policy Advisor at E3G, who has been spearheading this important project. Max today will lead us through our discussions and explorations. Our collaboration with E3G has depended on the support and strong leadership of Healy, the director of the Washington, D.C. office of E3G. I turn now to Claire and give her the microphone. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Max, for all your hard work pulling together not just today's event, but all the preceding, I think, 3 dialogues and multiple interviews and conversations we had with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Foundation and other experts from the trade world, the climate world, and also those concerned about economic development. I think therein is the strength and the beauty of the paper that we're publishing today that you'll find on E3G's website and the website for KAS. In this project, the dialogues and the paper, we try and bring together experts from these 3 distinct worlds to have a conversation about what are the practical interventions that we could ask the Europeans and the Americans to sort of coordinate together to really try and align trade flows with the climate imperative. I think heretofore, these worlds have been very separate. They have their own ecosystems, their own technical jargon, their own sort of rules, and indeed their own institutions where countries come together to cooperate, negotiate, coordinate. And so I think to make progress going forward and to make good on the commitments that countries have made in the Paris Agreement, and most recently in Glasgow at the COP summit, that they will make good on their commitments to cut their emissions and cut them at the pace and scale the scientists say is required to keep the temperature increase within safe limits. As a result of the diplomacy last year that we saw across the G20, the G7, and culminating at the COP, 90% of the global economy has committed to become net zero. That means net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or beyond. Just think about that for a moment. Net zero, that means we've got a long, long way to go, given emissions are still on the increase. And on the pathway to net zero, that means by 2030, we have to halve global emissions, halve by 2030. And as I said, emissions are still on the increase. So we've got to think about how we integrate climate into these other conversations and change the rules of the game so that we can change the incentives for countries and companies to cut their emissions faster. Now, we are very excited that the European Union tabled this new tool, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I think at the beginning it went through multiple different acronyms, but this is where we are settled at the moment, and energize this debate about how we can align climate and trade worlds. And we use the conversation, the interest, maybe some might say even the controversy around the CBAM as a point of entry, again, to bring these different constituencies together to have a refresh look at how we do align these different worlds and how we work horizontally to align trade flows with, as I said, with the need to decarbonize our economies very quickly. Now, in the paper, I'm looking forward to hearing what Caroline and Peter, how they have received and responding to the paper. In it, we look at the different policy options that have been tabled. Again, CBAM is just one of those. We used it as a point of entry to the conversation. There are other possible pathways and options. We look at the different options that Europe and the US together could make progress on. We look at the different scenarios of the world in which we may be heading and look at them and then come up with recommendations, practical recommendations that would like to see Europe and US work together to advance this agenda. Obviously, it's very difficult. It's also very controversial in many cases. We've got to think through the development angles of this because many countries, all countries, rely on trade to develop. So we've got to get the balance right between these various imperatives. But I do urge you to look at the very practical pathways we have suggested. And the key thing that Europe and the US together could help set new norms, change some of the rules, because they are each other's, I think, major trading partner, that together they account for, I think, a third of global GDP, around the same 30% more or less of imports and exports. So if Europe and the US can come together and have a conversation about setting new rules, new deals, looking at public procurement or subsidies, then it can help shift, shift the dynamics and set new norms in other entities. So, and I think that's a welcome step. I'll just end with an anecdote in that in 2016, when the new US president at the time decided to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, and also about the Iran agreement also. I remember many of the ambassadors in DC were saying he'll never pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. The consequences will be too severe. We'll use all the tools at our disposal. And actually, in the event, trade and sanctions were used when the US pulled out of the Iran agreement. When the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, trade was off the table, right? We did not use those tools or levers at the time. So I do think it's a huge step forward that we are talking about how to use these very real economic and geopolitical tools to change incentives. And so I do think that opens up space, and the main point here is to energize this debate and sort of inject new creativity and also a sense of urgency into how we use these tools. So without further ado, Max, I'll hand the mic back to you. I just want to say thank you to Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for these very interesting conversations, and I look forward to hearing what the respondents say and how we move this forward in very real and practical ways. Max.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Paul. And yes, I want to say we will have a conversation now. We will have, of course, statements from our two panelists. And if time permits, we will also take questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A. We'll do our best, if time permits, to take at least some of your questions. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists to you. And thank you very much for joining us from California. Caroline Freund, she is the Dean of the University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She's an expert in international trade and economic development. She's the co-chair of the Climate and Trade Task Force at the University of California, San Diego. Prior to joining the School of Global Policy and Strategy, she served as Global Director of Trade, Investment and Competitiveness at the World Bank. Caroline Freund also served as a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. In addition, she has worked as Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank after working for nearly a decade in the International Trade Unit of the Research Department. Caroline Freund began her career in the International Finance Division of the Federal Reserve Board and spent a year visiting the Research Department of the IMF. So just the expertise that we need to hear comments on all three vectors of our report, and in particular, of course, the question how to align them together. Caroline, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on what can be done and should be done, especially, of course, thinking from a transatlantic perspective, meaning we as in the United States and the European Union, but also, of course, beyond that, thinking as a global community, having your background working for multilateral institutions. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us and listening to your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And I think this is a very important topic. It's one we were working on at the World Bank. Before I left, they actually put out a report recently as well. Then I joined UCSD, and the Center for Climate and Diplomacy also was thinking about this topic, and the task force that I chaired, the center put out a report on the topic as well. And if you think about it, trade is an area that's inherently international. Cooperation is important, and climate is the same. We only have one planet, and we all have to save it together. And I think that I like the way we started this seminar talking about we have a transatlantic conference going on Zoom, because this is a great way to have the conversation, and we're saving all the carbon emissions from traveling around the world as well. So the first point I want to make about relating the two, because I think they often there's some misguided information out there, is that trade is really part of the solution to the climate problem, and for climate action. And the reason I say that is the whole idea of trade is comparative advantage, to produce things where resources are more abundant so you can save them in other places. And what we save by doing that, by extracting the fuel that's closer to the surface, or producing agriculture where the water table is larger, is much bigger than what we lose in transportation costs. And I do feel like the buy local movements completely overlook that. And just to give one egregious example, Saudi Arabia is a big dairy producer. And those cows are in air-conditioned chambers. That's not good for the environment. It would be much better to not drink locally produced dairy in Saudi Arabia. So the point is that trade is, the first point I want to make is just that trade is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem. There are issues, there are things that need to be corrected. Tariffs should be such that they encourage trade in environmental goods. But trade is part of the solution. I really like in the report the focus on the CBAM. It's something that in our Center for Commerce and Diplomacy report at University of California, San Diego, we do as well. And what I'm going to focus on in the report is just a few things that are missing. So I actually found it very, very useful. But I think there are some areas where I would completely agree, and I would put the CBAM at the center, but I think the report should have also emphasized the political necessity of the CBAM. And why do I say political necessity? If you think about why you have it, it's because to prevent leakage. So if you're thinking about producing putting in place a carbon tax, what happens when you put it in place? Well, maybe you want to start importing the product that's carbon intensive from somewhere where it's not taxed, because now that has become cheaper. So to prevent that from happening, you put the same tariff on imported goods so that it's a level playing field. So that's important to prevent economically that leakage, to prevent the emissions from remaining the same because you're shifting to a different country. But it's also important, and this is the addition I would add, it's also important to make it politically feasible to put that tax in place in the first place, because otherwise the carbon emitters are going to organize lobbies. They're going to work to stop that from happening. So it's really important politically as well to ensure that those that are affected remain willing to accept the new policies. The second point that I think we have to be careful about in this discussion is inequality. I think it's very easy to say, oh, this is, working on climate and reducing emissions is better for equality across the globe. Developing countries are being more hurt. Surely that's true on aggregate, but let's not forget, just as I think happened in trade, there are distributional consequences. People working in the fuel industries are going to be hurt. People in countries that depend on carbon intensive goods or oil extraction are going to be hurt by this change. And we need to address that directly rather than sweep it under the rug. And so I think that's another area that I would say we could focus on a little bit more. And then finally, the point I would like to make with respect to the report is in the scenarios, I would have liked to see more emphasis on the payments to developing countries that were promised and still have yet to materialize. So in 2009, 100 billion was pledged for developing countries by 2020, and this still hasn't been met, and it's 2022. And it is, if you look at the countries that have historically contributed to emissions, it's a lot of the rich countries. And it's the poor countries, and especially the island countries, that are being most severely impacted. And I think some reparations and support is due, and we need to think about that a little bit more. Why don't I stop there so we can keep the discussion? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. And I really appreciate also your honest feedback about what's missing and what should be more emphasized. And I think it's so interesting that you say what we did not focus on enough is the inequality piece, the basically global solidarity question. and the distributional impact. And that's absolutely right. And I think there needs to be more focus in our research, but also obviously also in the international conversation on climate and trade. We need to talk more also about development and development impacts. A question to you, how you see the US and the EU as transatlantic partners potentially making inroads specifically on the question of inequality and maybe just transition, or however you want to frame it, making also the prior element that you mentioned, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, more palatable or bearable for trade partners if there's also maybe some other component to it, a balancing factor. What are your views? What should be ideally? We're saying now it's maybe not all politically feasible, and you mentioned that too, political feasibility as a key component, of course, but from your perspective, what should be at least considered from our transatlantic partnership perspective?
Thanks very much. So let me start with the CBAM. And I think one important point, and this comes out of the UCSD report, is that it really should only be applied to new measures. So we already have an equilibrium with current trade and current measures. So it can become administratively costly and protectionist if it's applied to existing measures. So the whole point of it is to shift production, so it should be applied to new measures. I think one area of excellent cooperation could be around trying to price similarly and have similar sized carbon border adjustments. But I think it's gonna, for political reasons, be done quite differently on the two sides of the Atlantic. So while I think a carbon tax is the way to go, I think in the US, it's probably a political non-starter, unfortunately, and it may happen more through regulation. But then it becomes, the problem with that it becomes much more difficult to price that. If the EU is able to go the carbon tax way, then we can compare how companies are producing and their emissions to get the price right on the US side. So I think the US and the EU can work as leaders in this area and bring the rest of the world along. The other point I would like to make is that there are lessons from other policies that can help support developing countries. So in addition to finally getting the money out that was promised, the other area is doing something like GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences for developing countries, that I think what you'd want to do, that allows the least developed countries to avoid tariffs on certain products. And I think what we could imagine is the CBAM being phased in a similar way in the US and the EU for developing countries. You'd want it eventually to be in place because that will, and if developing countries can demonstrate how they're producing goods, you can even have a situation where you encourage trade in countries that use more renewables. With respect to inequality, let me just say that I think the issues are different in the US and the EU. I think the EU, of course, has many more social safeguards than the US does. I think there's inequality across the globe where certain countries are going to win and certain countries are going to lose that we have to think about. And then there's also inequality within the country because of jobs that will be lost and jobs that will be gained. And the issue in the US is to really find a way to transition those workers into other productive occupations. And we've seen the problem it causes in trade when people lose jobs through no fault of their own. We've seen what happened in the coal industry here. So politically, it's really an imperative to address this straight on and not say climate action is good for equality. It's not for everybody. And there are communities that are going to be hurt, and we need to address that directly.
Yes, thank you so much, Caroline. And I want to make a cut here and switch over to our second panelist, because of course we talked about the EU and Europe, or you mentioned them, and so we want to hear also from the European perspective. However, joining us from Washington, D.C., thank you so much. I welcome Peter Young. He has a long and varied experience in EU trade policy. He's presently the deputy head of the Trade and Agriculture section at the European Union Delegation to the United States in Washington, D.C. Post he took up in August 2020 and is now the Minister-Counsellor at the delegation. Prior to this assignment, he was a senior expert in the Director General for Trade at the European Commission in Brussels and was responsible for coordination and management of the EU's trade relations with the United States. And Paul, thank you so much. Peter, thank you so much for joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on our suggestions for aligning climate, trade, and development, and also your thoughts maybe already on what Caroline proposed we should or could do, especially, of course, regarding CBAM, a very current topic, but also the question of solidarity and inequality. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Max, for the introduction, and thank you also to Paul and Claire and to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and to E3G for the invitation to join and the work you've done in this report. I mean, I think the first thing I would underline is that we in Europe think that this is a hugely important issue, and we welcome all opportunities to discuss and engage on what we need to be doing. I think climate and the green transition is basically top of the pile in terms of political priorities in Europe, along with the parallel digital transformation. And I think the sense we have in terms of policy is that all policies need to be seen through the prism of what they contribute and what they can bring to advancing the green and the digital challenges that we face. I mean, I think the first thing to say about myself, I'm a trade official and I've worked for the EU for more than 20 years, but I've often come up against these questions of how trade policy interacts with other policy areas. Some time back, I was actually running the EU's version of RGSP, which includes a scheme for tariff preferences for the least developed, which is what you call everything but arms, because there are no tariffs on anything except arms. But that leads to trade in certain products, but it doesn't lead automatically to development. So it's always been clear to me that trade policy and the trade policy framework is important, but not sufficient in terms of delivering policy outcomes that we look for. And I think now the way in which we have to approach trade policy in the context of climate is basically precisely through the vision, through the prism of what's the contribution trade policy makes directly, and what is the contribution trade policy or trade instruments can make indirectly. And in the most recent presentation of EU trade policy, which is from about a year ago, there were three keywords underlined in the policy document: an open policy, a sustainable policy, and an assertive policy. And those three goes together. And the sustainable part, of course, links not just to climate, but also to improving labor standards and other things that contribute not just to how goods and services are made and traded, but also the conditions and the values that they represent. Now, I think in your report, which I enjoyed reading very much, there are lots of good ideas, lots of interesting ideas. And I think basically we are very happy to engage in all of them and basically playing and looking at them from different perspectives. I think to understand where we come from in Europe, we have a clear target set to reduce our own emissions. We are putting in place instruments which are meant to get us there. But we in Europe, I think, are less than 10% of global emissions. So just as you could say trade policy can't deliver everything, nor can European trade policy, nor European climate policy deliver everything. So we are bound, and we accept the need to basically do it in cooperation with the global commons. So that means basically we are ready to explore every avenue that could lead towards the goal of reducing improving the climate and reducing emissions on a global basis. So obviously, many of us in this conversation also begins with, well, what about the transatlantic conversation? Where can the EU and the US sort of be on the same page and lead the way? And I think that's important, and that's one thing we are doing. And in the trade context, that's one thing we will be doing in the framework of a new initiative that was launched last year called the Trade and Technology Council, which within its umbrella allows the scope to discuss issues like green procurement, CBAM, green tech, global trade challenges, all of which are relevant for the climate discussion. And of course, we're also willing and eager to explore working with other partners around the world, whether that's G7, G20, plurilateral initiatives, multilateral initiatives. Each and everything, I think we will be open to and pursue and look for good outcomes, and of course the right policy mix in terms of instruments and having the right people around the table. In our terms and in our trade policy as it stands now, basically we are trying and deliver climate relevant components, whether we're talking about our regional agreements. So in every free trade agreement that we negotiate or update at the moment, there is a sustainable development chapter trying to work towards shared commitments. Whether we're talking about our autonomous trade instruments, I mentioned already GSP in the past, where there's a new proposal for a new 10-year GSP presently on the table in Brussels. But also the trade policy dimension of policy instruments that are not trade instruments, but where there is a trade component, like deforestation, like the emissions trading scheme and its external component, which is CBAM, and like a proposal which is in the pipeline in Brussels on sustainable corporate governance, which basically will be about encouraging private actors, I mean the companies, the people, the economic actors who actually make decisions and make the economy run, to take proper account of sustainability factors in their own supply chains and in their own behavior. That's obviously got a strong labor component, but also a strong environmental and climate component. So, and same is true obviously in other areas of public policy like transport or energy, and of course also international development. What is the contribution those policy areas make to the shared goal of meeting the climate challenges? I think just to wrap up, I think it's more interesting to get into a more sort of focused Q&A on particular topics. But just a final comment, a quick comment about CBAM, which is something you hear a lot about because, of course, it's a very visible proposal. It is still a proposal from the Commission. It's under consideration at the moment by the legislative authorities in Europe, which is basically 50-50 responsibility between the European Parliament, so the elected members of the European Parliament, and the Council, which is the representatives of the 27 countries. And that process is, those two institutions are basically looking at what the Commission has put on the table. Obviously, and I speak here also as a Commission official, what the Commission put forward is a good, balanced, solid proposal that's the result of many months of consideration and a public consultation and an impact assessment. But of course, it's not yet the final product. So when we talk about CBAM as if it already is the final product, we should bear that in mind. And I would also underline that CBAM gets a lot of attention because it basically is a company-based, not necessarily not country-based approach towards offsetting or emissions embedded into products that are then traded. But the CBAM goes with an initiative in Europe called the Emissions Trading Scheme, which puts a price on carbon in the same sectors. So in effect, the CBAM is the environmental tool to prevent carbon leakage. It's not simply something that you see in isolation, because it goes with the rest of the climate-related package of proposals which are on the table in the legislative process. So let me stop there. I think basically very happy to engage in an open discussion on the proposals and do my best to explain what we're doing from a European perspective. But again, just to finish by underlining the importance, the urgency that we fully recognize of the trade and climate debate.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I wanted to follow up directly on what you said regarding the CBAM. It's still a proposal, but the question, of course, in the setting here, how much can this still be aligned in terms of bringing US perspectives on board? How much is there room for coordination? Carolyn mentioned it would be beneficial to have similar, maybe not identical, but similar pricing, similar CBAM approaches in the scope of what's possible. And how much is there an interest or a window of opportunity from an EU perspective for this coordination?
Well, I think the first thing that I would sort of repeat is that we're very open to dialogue with the United States and with others about the proposal and explaining why we're doing it and how we propose to do it. It's clearly under the proviso that the final version of CBAM has yet to be determined. That will be whatever comes out of the legislative pipeline in Brussels. But the approach as it's presented and thought through by the Commission in terms of the proposal that was made is basically built around the notion that you focus on a small number of sectors which are largest relative contributors to emissions. There is a clear link between what we're doing on the internal market in terms of incentivizing a reduction in emissions by putting a price on tons of carbon. And the goal of CBAM is basically to prevent or reduce the risk of carbon leakage, to, in a way, incentivize other countries to go in similar paths. Countries like Canada, for example, are also looking at similar type of instruments, but it's not an expectation that everybody goes down the same path as we do. So therefore, we are very much open to conversations about the approaches that other countries are taking. And I would say basically with the US, we're going to have a sort of a test case on this, in particular in the sector of steel, because we have agreed to launch a conversation or discussions on a sustainable approach to steel and aluminium, two of the sectors which are covered by the emissions trading scheme in Europe and the CBAM, precisely to see, well, the instruments that are used to reduce carbon emissions or to incentivize decarbonization may be different in Europe compared to here, but are they leading to the same place? And therefore, is there a way to recognize that in the instruments we put in place? I mean, just to say, even without an explicit carbon price, CBAM basically would apply on the emissions record of individual producing companies. So if a company is producing steel or another product subject to CBAM, is taking steps and will take more steps to reduce its emissions, and records that basically is credited in the adjustment that they would pay at the border. So if that is the result of a regulatory framework working indirectly as opposed to a carbon price working directly, the net outcome would still be comparable.
Great. I mean, you already mentioned the role of other countries and other countries being interested in exploring the options. And you already mentioned the steel and aluminum discussions. So I want to throw in this concept of the carbon club, or it also goes under different names, but this would be basically, well, we don't know exactly what it would be, but there are different ideas for bringing multiple countries together who are climate progressive, who have ambitious climate targets, who would align their carbon leakage countermeasures, whatever they might be and however they might be geared, to align them and harmonize them, and also avoiding trade impacts among themselves. So not quite clear yet. There's different, probably different expectations and ideas what this would look like. But Caroline, do you think this would be something that can be done in a way that's also compatible with the question of having developing options or development options for countries that are not in the club, and how this can be constructed in a way that it is compatible with the idea of having, well, global solidarity, and having in mind also the emerging economies and also the least developed countries.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think one point, and Pete mentioned this as well, about the EU can't do it alone because they're 10% of global emissions. If you look at the top 10 emitters, half are not OECD countries. And so I think there are things that can be done together, and it doesn't mean like-minded partners shouldn't move ahead. I think this is an area where we need to move in all directions where there's space. So in the same way that in trade, I would say go unilateral, go multilateral, and go regional, I would say the same thing on climate. Whatever avenues are open, take them. That said, I don't think it's an area where countries can, I think there's a danger in of focusing too much on the like-minded countries and leaving out the rest of the world, where then the emissions continue to grow there and there's only one planet. So walling yourself off isn't going to help here. So really needs to continue on all fronts, even more so than on trade, I would say. That said, I think as long as the conversation is kept open, development is kept in mind. So as I said before, thinking about GSP type of approaches to ensure that developing countries aren't suddenly hit by a new tariff, and then encouragements to come along vis-a-vis actually putting forward the money that was promised, and ideally even more funds to help countries that can't make the transition on their own.
Yes, thank you so much. And of course, it's probably a lot more palatable if there's something that's given also, and not just barriers built or walls being built. Peter, I want to hear if you can also maybe share some perspective how the EU considers these proposals.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think the first important thing is obviously dialogue, so we comprehend what others have in mind in terms of their own toolboxes. I mean, if you like, in Europe, we have our own toolbox. I mean, ETS, the emissions trading scheme, already exists, but there's a proposal on the table in the legislature, basically to widen its scope, to make it bite more in terms of the actual commercial impact. I mean, economic impact on producers inside the EU. and that obviously is backed up by the CBAM for the external dimension. So if you like, those are the two main pieces of our own approach, and we need to understand what others plan to do as well themselves, so we can understand how they would fit together in terms of a more broader plurilateral stroke global initiative. I mean, I think, as I said, we are open to exploring with all groupings that make sense, and I agree with what Caroline was saying. In a way, there are elements of the policy that have to be pursued autonomously, or through regional agreements, or plurilaterally, or even multilaterally. But of course, the choice of the focus has an impact on what you may be able to do and how quickly you may be able to do it. In Geneva, we are participating and very supportive of the plurilateral discussions that are going on trade and environment, and I think there are around 70 participants in that process. But also when we meet with other economies from the G20, we also would push them, and that of course includes several of the major emitters in the developing world. We would also push them to try and make commitments to go in the same direction as we are. But I mean, what is possible in the real world may not be what is desirable in terms of if we were starting from scratch. So I think it is a product of consultation and diplomacy. And I think when it comes to notions of sort of clubs or I don't want to quote Groucho Marx about not wanting to be a member of a club that wants to have me, but I think basically the serious point is that that's really just a label, and you have to look behind the label and see, well, what actually a country's economies proposing to do in terms of their own ambitions for their own. I mean, recognizing that not everybody starts in the same place, recognizing also that everybody will have concerns about the transition process. And within Europe, we also have that, because as you move away from coal mining, then there are communities which risk being left behind, and you have to think, well, how do you manage that? That's a variation on discussion we've had in the trade context before about what do you do for communities or industries affected by a need for adjustment, and how do you mobilize other instruments to make that process more manageable.
Peter, and to follow up with the question about the give and take, of course, I mean, it's not directly trade policy related, but seeing the connection, how third countries, how countries who are maybe emerging economies or maybe low-income countries might be more open to policy measures such as CBAM or others limiting carbon leakage, or sectoral agreements, if there is a counter offer or an complementing offer package that can be either, we heard the GSPs, or can be also, when we talk about climate finance, direct financial support. And I know that's going beyond the trade policy angle, but still, is this something where you think the EU is looking into this, is exploring options, and or is it something that's still too early to say?
Well, I think sure. I think the EU is looking at these sort of issues. Of course they are. I mean, if you take the group of least developed countries, so the poorest countries, they are not particularly affected by our proposal on CBAM at the moment, because they're not producing the products which are affected. There is one exception to that, which is one country which has a aluminium industry. So you can't generalize and say it's all the LDCs have a problem with CBAM. There may be one LDC has a problem with CBAM, but then you have to look, well, how can we potentially assist that country in reducing the carbon impact of that industry? And of course, as development assistance is not imposed by a partner like the EU. It's basically demand driven, and it has to be part of the partner country's own strategy for advancing its development. So it's certainly an important thematic area for EU, but also other developed countries' activities in this area. But it has to be done in partnership with the countries that are affected, and of course it has to be done as part of a broader strategy for economic advancement and for development.
Thank you. Thank you. We're getting closer to the last few minutes in this conversation, and I want to come back to a question that Carolyn, you touched on this a number of times, but I wanted to ask this now straight and directly, asking, do we have the right fora? Do we have the right platforms for discussing trade, climate, and development together on equal footing? You mentioned we have different, plurilateral, multilateral fora. We have existing discussions at the OECD, at the G7, the G20, of course, the WTO. But the question is, where would we be able to have this conversation on the 3-in-1? And can we integrate this in the existing platforms, or is there a need, is there a gap for new formats?
Yeah, that's really an excellent question. And I like the way it was framed in the report as well. And I think the view there was to work through existing platforms. And I would tend to agree with that for the reason that I don't think the world has any appetite for developing a new platform right now. What I do worry about is that the existing institutions are pretty weak and much weaker than they were at the time, say, of the global financial crisis. I think the WTO is probably the biggest example of that. But even the G7, G20, the type of action we've seen during this crisis, which is far more severe than the financial crisis, hasn't really paralleled what we've seen in the past. So I think thinking about how to strengthen the existing institutions, and that will require probably US leadership. With all deference to my European friends, it just seems that there are too many competing interests within the EU to ever fully take the lead. Climate is an area where they have taken the lead, and perhaps they can within the institutions, and I would really like to see that, but it remains to be seen. But in general, I think working together to strengthen the existing institutions, not just for climate and trade, but for other areas as well, health, will be really critical for the future.
Thank you. And since you mentioned that there is a need for US leadership and that there might not be enough consensus and willpower on the European side, I want to give the opportunity to Peter to respond to this and maybe give just his perspective on how we can use or not use the existing fora.
Thanks. I mean, I think the main thing I'd say is that I'm also a bit skeptical about creating new institutions or new fora for the sake of it. We already have quite a plethora of institutions, and there's already, I think, a risk that the efforts are too diluted across the existing range of institutions. No one quite knows which one's doing what. So, I mean, I think when I say that, yes, in Europe, we can work in these different areas, that's true, but also we ought to think about where is the value added, where is the best sort of contribution that each particular strand of activity or each particular forum might be able to deliver. On the WTO side, I mean, I think we all know the challenges and the joys of a consensus-based decision-making process in WTO. I mean, the conversation has moved on from the time when environmentalists used to complain that WTO was too powerful and was taking actions which were undermining environmental goals. Now it's sort of moved on a bit that people think, okay, can the WTO take actions to achieve climate goals? And in a way, maybe that's again not necessarily its role, but nonetheless, I mean, we very much think there should be a role in this space for the WTO, for the multilateral institution, and we on the European side are active in the plurilateral group on trade and environment, which is also looking at some climate-related issues. And as I said, there's roughly, I think, 70 participants or so around the table in that context, and that includes I mean, traditional trade conversations about, well, how can you facilitate trade and promote positive outcomes by reducing barriers, by increasing or improving access to clean tech or green tech products, promoting the circular economy, or basically facilitating as opposed to restricting trade, knowing, of course, that it's economic actors that take decisions, not international institutions. So I think basically I would come back to what I said at the beginning, which is from our side in Europe, the green transformation and the digital transformation are really the two top policy priorities. And we have our very complicated decision-making processes and sometimes rather slow ways in which we formulate position. But when we get there, I think we do. The merit is that basically there is a strong stakeholder and member state and the European Parliament buy-in that basically means we can then deliver what we've said we want to try and do. But as I said, we are less than 10% of emissions, and all the good things that we can do will not solve the whole problems which the global community has to tackle together. So yes, I mean, I think we are obliged to work with all partners, and of course, working with the US is very high on that priority list, given the impact which transatlantic cooperation can have in trade as in other areas. I mean, EU-US cooperation is very important, sometimes essential for making progress, but it's not enough on its own. It has to be combined with efforts and cooperation with other key partners as well.
Thank you, Peter. And I think these are also very good points. We talked a lot about barriers and about containing carbon leakage, and it's all very defensive, but also talking about enabling trade and enabling and supporting, fostering trade, especially of course, environmentally positive goods and services. And also, of course, talking about technology transfer, very important points that maybe we didn't have that much time to talk about now in this very short hour. I want to give Caroline the opportunity to maybe respond with some final thoughts for this meeting here, because we're coming to the end of our session.
I think it's been a great discussion, and thanks again for inviting me. Maybe just to build on a point you just made, which is the importance of trade in developing environmentally friendly goods. And, if you think about solar panels, windmills, all these things are produced through global value chains. And they can be produced far more efficiently, electric bikes, electric cars. This is the future. And I think we do need to think about ensuring that those technologies spread as quickly as possible, those production networks remain intact, and we shift to that. I think as an example around the institution not having enough power, the WTO on environmental goods, there was an agreement, but it got stymied by political interests and whether or not countries were trying to use it to promote certain products, et cetera, et cetera. But just to say, we need to build our institutions, continue trading these goods, and continue working together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much, Peter, for joining us this morning for this very fruitful, very inspiring conversation. Thank you specifically from my side for the comments on the report. We will continue our research. I want to thank also, of course, the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and especially Paul Linnarz and his colleague Janine Lero, and also Claire Healy for making this work possible. And I look forward to further conversations. I want to thank all the participants, especially also for asking questions in the chat and Q&A. And I hope you found some interesting responses and thoughts in the session. I look forward to continuing these conversations on aligning climate, trade, and development, and say, have a great rest of your day. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.